planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head, they propagandize fake chocolate points, flat out lies. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, I'm happy to be able to get him back. It's Paul Jay's coming on the podcast by George live line. We're doing a recording here to get this straight, get it right. We had some technical difficulties on the internet in the previous show, but I'm sure this is going to be good, and you're going to like this because this guy's on top of it. He's all over it. He's an authority, and for folks that may not know, Paul Jay is a journalist and filmmaker. He's the founder and host of the Analysis.News, a video and audio current affairs interview and commentary show and website. Paul's films have won numerous awards at major festivals around the world. He's the past chair of the Documentary Organization of Canada and was the founding chair of the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. And of course, you know me, I'm a hockey guy, so I gotta love Canadians, folks. Jay was the co-creator and co-executive producer of Face Off and Counterspin up there, a nightly primetime debate program that ran for 10 years on CBC News World. And of course, he was the founder of the Real News Network based in Baltimore. I think that's where he spends most of his time now. And he's currently working on
Toronto.
Oh, you're in Toronto. Okay, great. He's currently working on a documentary series with Daniel Ellsberg based on Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine. And I gotta do a little brief update here on my own little tidbit piece of filmmaking. They're making a documentary called Hero, the documentary. It's on the life and times of Jason Oglesby. He's kind of a local legend down here. He's the guy that you may have seen. They took a Pulitzer Prize winning photo of him dangling from a chain on a crane. He pulled a woman out of the Des Moines River that was drowning. And then he met an untimely demise on his own part. Well, my little role of this is I wrote some lyrics for a song called Hero, and they're going to include that in the documentary. And I'm going to bring this slide up to show people Cullen Laveau, the guy that's doing the documentary, is out shooting some more video, and that's getting updated now. But to transition here to Paul's work, he's doing a documentary, a movie on a guy that I consider to be an American legend. I mean, a real hero in many ways, Daniel Ellsberg. And it's all about his work with something called the Doomsday Machine. And this is a long, laborious work in progress that Paul's involved in. And Paul, if you could, just update us on how the doc's going.
We're still in early stages. I've done about maybe 20 days of interviewing with Dan. This is based on his book, Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And as I guess most of your listeners or viewers know, Dan released the Pentagon Papers.
Yes.
But before he worked for the Pentagon in Vietnam, where he was helping develop the plans for the war in Vietnam and had access to all these secret papers that he released in order to help stop the war. Before that, he worked for RAND Corporation as a nuclear war planner. Literally, the RAND Corporation was contracted by mostly the Air Force, and Dan was part of the team that advised them on how to wage and when to wage nuclear war and issues connected to it. And so his book, and maybe even more so, this documentary series, is about the transformation of Ellsberg from a very committed Cold Warrior who really did believe the Soviet Union was another type of Hitlerite country, meaning a totalitarian regime trying to seek global domination, and he was continuing that fight. He'd been a Marine himself, and then he starts to discover that the Cold War is based on several, maybe more, but several big lies, and it starts to transform him from a very passionate Cold Warrior who leads him to what happened in Vietnam, where he releases the Pentagon Papers and then becomes an anti-war activist and a very big critic of U.S. foreign policy, war policy, but particularly on nuclear weapons issues, because he believes, and he's certainly not the only one, it's as dangerous now. The possibility of nuclear war is as dangerous now as it's ever been. And there were a few key moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1958 in Taiwan with China, 1983, the false reading of incoming flights by the Soviets, who one guy decides not to tell the Soviet president, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here talking. But the conflict, both with Russia and Ukraine and with China over Taiwan, Ellsberg thinks that we're heading into as dangerous territory as we have ever been.
I want you to talk just briefly about the parallels between Daniel Ellsberg and the situation with Julian Assange. Assange is rotting in that jail in London, and Ellsberg, as I understand it, they were going to jail him. I mean, he was headed not in a good place, but some kind of a quirk in the law or something allowed him to escape because he was going to be imprisoned. And to clarify again for the viewers, Ellsberg was not a publisher. He was more of a leaker. He was the guy that had access to these Pentagon Papers because of his work at the Rand Corporation. He brought them to the publishers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Pentagon Papers got out there, had a lot to do with ending that war maybe earlier than it would have been, but they weren't finished with him. They were going to stick him in prison if they could, right?
Yeah, what happened is he was charged, I believe, under the Espionage Act.
Yes.
And he definitely did leak. What he did was illegal. His argument was the war was far more illegal, the war in Vietnam. Based on a lie, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that this American ship that was supposedly blown up by the North Vietnamese, that turned out to be another lie.
Yes.
But they did charge him, and the trial began. And in the course of the trial, it was discovered that President Nixon, had ordered the plumbers team that was to do Watergate to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. And when the Ellsberg defense found out about that and told the judge that this is an abuse of prosecutorial power, the judge agreed and threw the case out. And in fact, that helped lead to the whole Watergate scandal, which helped lead to the downfall of Nixon. So in that way, the release of the Pentagon Papers ended the war earlier because it eventually brought down Nixon.
Well, Paul and I could talk forever, and I have a tendency to digress, but the connection with Assange, the similarities, the parallels there, Ellsberg has gone on record saying the cases are, I don't know, maybe virtually identical. I mean, they're different. But
well, I would say they're not. They're not identical, and in some ways the Assange case is a more serious threat to journalism.
Yes.
Than Dan's case was. When Dan released the papers, the New York Times, Washington Post, initially the Nixon administration did get injunctions to try to stop them from publishing. But Dan and the people supporting him, which included Gar Purvitz, if people may know him, they came up with a smart plan, which is they photocopied something like 15 copies of these hundreds and hundreds of pages.
A page at a time.
And gave it to about 14, 15 newspapers. And so they would slap an injunction on, the Times, and then the Post would publish, or the other way around, I can't remember. And then if they tried to do an injunction on, then one of the other papers started to publish, and then another paper started to publish. That was back in the day where newspapers actually would defy the government in this way. I don't know if that would happen now, especially since 9/11. A lot of changes have taken place in American newsrooms. But the prosecution, I would call persecution of Assange, is against a publisher, not a leaker. Chelsea Manning knowingly broke the law and did it because she felt it had to be done, and she was right, and she was willing to pay the price, make the sacrifice. Dan's the same thing. Dan fully expected to go to jail and knew he was doing something illegal, but ending the war in Vietnam was more important. He, as you say, it was almost a quirk that he didn't go to jail. But Assange is not a leaker. Assange is a publisher.
Yes.
And the Obama administration was not going to prosecute Assange because apparently they said to themselves, if we prosecute Assange, then don't we have to prosecute the New York Times, the Post, McClatchy, all the papers that actually publish the stuff in association with WikiLeaks? So they didn't pursue it. Trump restarted the case against Assange. And as we know now, with Pompeo, they were even talking about ways to kidnap and assassinate Assange.
Yes.
And Biden has continued the attempt to extradite Assange from England, even though it was his own administration with Obama that came to the conclusion that this would actually be an attack on press freedom more generally, and they're continuing it anyway. So in some ways, I think the prosecution of Assange is actually more serious than the prosecution of Ellsberg, although Ellsberg certainly was willing to make the sacrifice of spending the rest of his life in jail, and would have if it wasn't for the weird set of circumstances.
Well, as I mentioned at the onset, Paul's a real journalist. He's a working journalist, and this Assange situation is the biggest threat to modern journalism in our lifetime. So it's something that we could talk about all during this podcast. I want to move off of it here eventually, but I'm going to bring up on screen the front page of this morning's New York Times, Paul, and they've got front page coverage of this drone attack on these civilians in Syria. Now, the New York Times is all over that, and I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, what the hell? They want you to believe, and it's a big part of it, obviously, that the reason they're pursuing Assange is for releasing that drone attack, or not drone, a helicopter attack, that Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad that resulted in the deaths of civilians. And that makes me believe in this house of mirrors that we live in, Paul, that there's more to them chasing Assange than just that. I think it goes much deeper than that. Because how the hell can New York Times have this on their front page and Assange be sitting in a prison in London?
Well, I'd answer a couple of ways. I think one, Assange didn't just release the footage of Chelsea Manning's footage of the helicopters killing the people in Iraq. I think a lot of this has to do as well, not that wasn't significant, all the Manning stuff, but also the release of the Hillary Clinton's emails, and they started the stuff that was getting out was starting to really threaten the deep state. And I use the word deep state. I know some people say it's a Trumpism. Yeah. It certainly isn't. It just means the professional state, which is deep. The professional state's deep. And there's a lot of different intelligence agencies that all operate at the same time. But what Assange did that's different what the Times is doing is that he got access through leakers to thousands and thousands of documents, whether it was Chelsea's or Hillary's emails. And it starts to expose the system of lying that permeates U.S. foreign policy. Mm-hmm. The American state, Gore Vidal called it and others have called it the national security state, which emerged after World War II. And this essentially gets established by Truman. And to a large extent, this is something Ellsberg says, to do with the nuclear war and the military-industrial complex. To a large extent, it's based on the need to juice up not just American power, but American military spending. And a lot of lies are necessary to juice up the spending. So, for example, when Kennedy ran in 1960, one of his big planks was that there's a missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Stratcom, the American Air Force, was telling the world and telling Kennedy that the Soviet Union had 1,000 ICBMs and that they were, in all likelihood, preparing a first strike otherwise against the United States. Otherwise, why have 1,000 ICBMs when the United States at the time perhaps had maybe 40? Some say it could have been 200, but I think the number normally, it may have been only 40 or 50. And Kennedy and the Air Force and others, of course, in the companies that were going to manufacture all the ICBMs were screaming that there has to be this massive push to build ICBMs. Anyway, to make a long story short, Ellsberg's in the cafeteria at the Pentagon one day sitting with his friend who says, have you seen the new satellite pictures? They figured out how many ICBMs the Soviet Union has. And he said, how many? He says, you're not going to believe it. He says, it's not 1,000. It's 4. 4. The Air Force were counting grain silos and calling them missile silos. Like it was a total piece of bullshit. But not only did that mean that there was no need to build 1,000 ICBMs, it was an incredible opportunity to say to the Soviet Union, well, we know you've only got 4, so we'll reduce our numbers and let's stay, under 10 each. It's enough to be a deterrent, but it's also a manageable amount, so this thing doesn't spiral out of control. Well, of course, that isn't what happened. And this is where Ellsberg makes a confession. He actually recommends to Kennedy letting Khrushchev know through a speech a general's going to give that the Americans had figured out the real number, because Khrushchev was bluffing. He was saying there was parity. Maybe the number was 200, and Khrushchev was claiming to have 200. So, but instead of using this as an opportunity to avoid a nuclear arms race, they let Khrushchev know that they know, and they start to threaten over Berlin. There's a fight over East and West Berlin at the time, and whether the Americans are going to be able to send their troops into West Berlin. So one of Khrushchev's responses is, well, okay, fine. Now you know we don't have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you're right. We don't have a ton of missiles we can throw at you from here. Whereas you have tons in Europe you can throw at us, and you've got what you have on American soil. So that's one of the reasons Khrushchev sends nuclear missiles to Cuba. Now, they're mostly they're defensive, but there's something. So the bottom line here is that this lie of the missile gap, it's just one of many, many lies that support this military-industrial complex, and the war policies go through the various wars, virtually every one, and, including most recently Iraq, which is an enormous lie about weapons of mass destruction. Well, what Julian was doing by creating a platform for leakers like Chelsea, a place that could really expose at the very heart of the national security state stuff that they didn't want exposed, at least not with their own documents this way. There's a big difference between, people who kind of know and say, and they're insiders, but when you got the documents, it carries more weight. So what WikiLeaks was doing was a real threat to this whole systemic lying of the American national security state. So why are they going after him? When the logic was under the Obama administration, well, if we go after him, that means we have to go after the Times and the Post and whatever. Well, maybe that's why they're doing it now, is they want the Times and the Post and others to be concerned about working with people like Assange.
I never considered that angle very much. And that's the chilling effect that journalists are so worried about. And God, this is just listening to Paul. This is why I love his podcast, love his show and his perspective. I mean, he's a great journalist, but he puts it in a historical perspective like I think no one else does. And that movie's coming out. This is going to be all about Daniel Ellsberg and this doomsday machine. This is not going to be Tom Hanks and, you know, that thing that we saw called The Post or whatever. This is going to be real truth. I mean, I'm going to be front row and center for that. I just can't wait for that documentary to come out. But I want to move along here so that we can get Paul on his way so that he can work on that movie. When last time you were on, Paul, we talked about the January 6th situation, and I even got some comments from people that said, what the hell is this guy talking about, not calling that an insurrection? But I thought the key nomenclature that you used was a coup within a failed coup, or a failed coup within a failed coup. Could you amplify on that a little?
Yeah, well, let me just say, an insurrection, if you're going to call it an insurrection, you've got to have some guns. You got to have real force, or you got to have millions of people. I mean, you know, what does it mean? An insurrection is you're going to take over the government, take over the reins of the government. And you don't do that without, you know, a military, really. So to call it an insurrection is just an exaggeration. But that isn't the issue. It was part of, I think, and I think there's lots of evidence, it was part of a plan for a coup. And it's not the same. Like the people running into the buildings and all that, that wasn't the main act. That was like the final act of a failed coup. The real theater, I shouldn't say theater, the real thing that happened leading up to the 6th was there seemed to be a plan by Trump and working, you know, Flynn was in on it, and who knows who else, certainly behind the scenes, Steve Bannon. And it kind of goes like this. In September, and this is before the election of 2020, Steve Bannon goes on Tucker Carlson's show and calls for a Stop the Steal campaign. Now, there hasn't been an election yet, and they're already planning a Stop the Steal campaign. So they know Trump's going to lose. And so in fact, he didn't lose by as much as a lot of people thought he would. He still got, 75 million votes. It was a lot closer than people thought, given the guy had completely screwed up the pandemic.
Yes.
But that campaign becomes part of a very relatively worked out plan. Anyway, I don't know how well worked out. But in the days, once Trump loses, then the plan is mobilize across the country. Bannon announces on the Tucker Carlson show he's going on a cross-country tour. They thought they were going to be able to mobilize people in many cities to storm state legislatures and others. It didn't really pan out. But Trump tries to intimidate the governor of Georgia and the secretary of state of Georgia, and he says, give me 15,000 votes. That's one of the building blocks. Other Republican-controlled legislatures are supposed to try to reverse the choosing of the Electoral College. But there's other machinations that go on that in the White House. But I think the key to understanding what happened is on January 4th, the 10 former secretaries of defense issue a letter to the Washington Post, essentially warning the armed forces, the military, to stay out of the elections. And it's clearly meant to be directed towards the Trump-appointed Secretary of Defense. On the same day, Admiral Stavridis, who was the former Supreme Commander of NATO, he writes a column in Time magazine supporting the letter from the 10 former secretaries. And this is a guy who's now retired, but he's one of the most senior executives at Carlyle Group, which is a big private equity fund, amongst other things, is a big investor in the military-industrial complex. And on the same day, the Financial Times has an editorial, January 4th, 2 days before the 6th, ends by saying, as bizarre as it seems, there is a coup in progress. So the real story is the story of, quote unquote, an attempted coup. Now, what happens, I think, is pretty apparent now, and we'll see whether this January 6th commission at Congressional Committee actually does anything on this, because so far all the attention seems to be on the quote unquote insurrection of the 6th, which is missing the real story. We'll see if the real story actually comes out, but the Milley, the Joint Chiefs, head of the chair of the Joint Chiefs, several other heads of the different branches of the armed forces, they actually issue public statements telling the military to stay out. Now, you don't do all of this, organize all of this, if you don't think there's a real threat. And it looks like the plan is certain, at least sections of the military were being organized, that when the quote unquote supposed insurrection of the 6th takes place, then the military can come in and have several things at the same time. The military, meaning some section of the military, certainly not the senior leadership, because they were clearly against it. But if they've been able to pull off the reversal in Georgia, if they've been able to get some Republican legislatures to flip the Electoral College, or at least repudiate some of the election results, if all of that had actually worked, then you have this stuff goes on the Hill. Then they would have a rationale for the armed forces to come in, declare martial law, Trump remains president, and they get to call some other kind of election, assuming they're going to have an election at all. It was a crazy scheme. It was nuts. I don't think it had any chance of succeeding. But the most important reason why it had no chance of succeeding, although there's probably many reasons, is that the elites, the real power in the United States, which means the financial and corporate elites, the billionaire class, the majority, not all, because Trump's got his billionaire backers and many, many multi-millionaire backers, but the majority did not want Trump to cause such a disruption to the transition to Biden, because it's not good for business.
Yeah.
What would happen? It would be chaos. The stock market would go nuts. Global finance would go nuts. China would go nuts. It would have been chaos if you all of a sudden don't have a peaceful transition to Biden. And of course, the elites didn't mind Biden coming in. Many of them even supported him because, one, Trump was going nuts while he was in office. And the best example of what I'm talking about, how the elites bailed on Trump, is that on January 6th, the doors of Congress are breached around 2:10 in the afternoon. At 3:04 in the afternoon, the American Association of Manufacturers issues a press release calling on Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Trump. Now, this is one of the biggest lobbyist associations on behalf of corporate America. They have loved Trump for 4 years. They've been amongst his biggest backers because they got every tax cut they ever wanted. They got all the deregulation they wanted. But they had come to the conclusion that Trump had gone mad and this would be bad for business. So it's time to dump Trump. Now, you don't make that decision in an hour.
Yeah.
The doors get breached at 2:10. You don't have a statement calling for Pence to remove Trump an hour later, and you're prepared for this. So clearly, the preponderance of the elites had decided they were going to get rid of Trump. Now, who organized that 10 secretary? This is where it gets even more interesting in some ways. And this piece hasn't been talked about enough. Who organizes the letter of the 10 secretaries of defense calling on the military not to intervene? Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney. Mm-hmm. So these aren't guys, certainly Dick Cheney and Liz, I don't think we've ever heard her disagree with her father in any way, including some of the people of these secretaries of defense, if not most of them. These are not people that are against authoritarian government. Certainly, Dick Cheney was one of the biggest proponents, open proponents, of what people call the imperial presidency. Violating democratic norms is not Cheney's problem. He doesn't mind. I mean, what's the what is a bigger violator of democratic norms than an illegal invasion of a country that kills hundreds of thousands of people and doesn't have the authorization by Congress? I mean, Cheney doesn't mind this kind of stuff. But Cheney represents, and sort of George Bush and that whole crew, they represent a real face of corporate America, of the military-industrial complex.
Defense business, yeah.
And others, to a large extent fossil fuel, although Trump has a lot of backing from fossil fuel. So their differences with Trump and the Trumpist forces are not that they really give a damn about quote-unquote democratic institutions. And if you want to ask me later what I think of these democratic institutions, you can, because it's a complicated story, but not the way it's normally talked about. It's not that. It's that group that represents a really established corporate financial interest, yes, on the right, but the financial sector and such didn't have too much trouble with the Bush-Cheney administration. They don't want this kind of authoritarianism to be led by anyone other than them. It has to be the Cheney group, and not necessarily him individually, but it has to be under the control of the really dominating forces of corporate America and the financial sector. And Trump is too much of a loose cannon. His financial backing didn't come when he got elected. It didn't come from the sort of main, even Republican funders. It was who stepped in. Robert Mercer, this crazy, batshit crazy hedge fund guy, multi-billionaire, who was the guy that owned Breitbart News, and he's the guy that gave Trump Bannon and Kellyanne Conway and I can't remember. There's another one.
The crazy train, boy, yeah.
Well, but skilled people in manipulating public opinion and manipulating sections of the working class. And Sheldon Adelson is the other one that stepped in with the money. Another guy, another batshit crazy billionaire who isn't part of the main circles of the ruling elites. So I did a piece with Larry Wilkerson, and I titled it the split between the hard right and the far right. It's a real split, a real division, and there's a part of this populist, quote unquote, I don't even like using the word populist, but of this Trumpist alliance that actually really hates the Cheney-Bush crowd and doesn't even like sections of the military-industrial complex. It's very interesting splits that are taking place.
Yeah. Well, Wilkerson is great. Let me ask you this now, before we move off of this particular topic. For this to work, and Trump was delusional and has been for some time, obviously, but for it to work, he had to have Pence and McConnell to play along with him. Now, they didn't play along with him in the end, and maybe that's what stopped the thing from becoming worse than it was. But there's a lot of reasons. They knew about it.
Because of what I said, because the National Association of Manufacturers, because the elites had told McConnell and Pence what to do.
Yeah. Wow. That's America today, folks.
That's who they're answering to. But I called it, you said at the beginning, I called it a failed coup within a failed coup.
Yeah.
Like, there's still the question, which I don't know why I seem to be the only one asking. So unless I'm really missing something, the sergeant of arms of the Senate is the guy who really had the authority when asked by the chain of command to get the National Guard to show up to defend the Capitol buildings, goes from the Capitol Hill Police, chief of police, to this three-person committee, which is the Sergeant of Arms of the Senate, Sergeant at Arms of the House, and for some reason the congressional architect, because they needed a third person there. I don't know what the hell he knows. Because they deal with infrastructure issues.
Yeah.
And then, but the real senior person on that three-person committee is the Sergeant of Arms of the Senate. And who does he answer to?
McConnell,
The majority party of the Senate. So who's that? That's Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
And there's an actual quote in the Washington Post later from the chief of police of the Capitol Hill Police, where he's quoted as saying, the morning of the 6th, I pleaded with the Sergeant of Arms of the Senate to call the National Guard in now. And it came out later that he'd actually been asking for it for at least 2 days leading up to the event. And the quote, and this is in the Washington Post, the quote is, the Sergeant of Arms of the Senate says, I'll have to ask my boss, McConnell, and get back to you. Now, there's no secret that's the chain of command, except according to this quote in the Post, he never did get back to the chief of police, and they didn't call in the National Guard until many hours later. So why didn't McConnell authorize the request to the armed forces to bring in the National Guard? And I don't know why more people aren't asking that question. And here's where I go off stuff I know to be true to speculation. But it seems to me it's good speculation. Once McConnell realizes that the armed forces are not going to step in, Trump didn't get what he wanted out of Georgia or any of the other states, and the whole thing's falling apart, who does McConnell hate most in the world? Well, it's got to be Trump.
Yeah.
He's been kissing Trump's ass for 4 years. He never wanted Trump to be president, but he had no choice but to play along. So now he sees an opportunity. And let me again say, speculation. Now he has an opportunity. Let the shit show happen. What's it going to amount to? If the military step in, a bunch of people will run around, go nuts. Yes, there'll be some violence. But in the end of it all, Trump will get blamed for it all. And finally, says McConnell, I'll be rid of this fucking asshole. And that was his coup. But that failed as well. He had completely underestimated the amount of support Trump had even after the events of January 6th.
It's real, yeah. That's for sure. They're out there, folks. There's lots of them. They love the man. He may be coming back in 2024. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, Paul, again, talking about the Washington Post, that op-ed piece by those three generals that was in the Washington Post. I'm going to throw up on screen this coverage of it in Newsweek. But these generals, and at least one of them, Matthew Ho even said, this guy's a sober, reflective, clear-thinking individual. They're thinking that we may have another coup attempt or something worse by at least 2024, and they're wanting, and maybe they're just wanting, but they're wanting to war game this. They're wanting to have preparation across all branches of the military to get ready for something that's coming in just a couple of years.
Well, one, I think they're right.
Oh, God.
And two, here's the problem. And this is what they don't want to talk about. This guy, Stavridis, the admiral I talked about, he had another article in Time magazine a couple of weeks after January 6th where he talked about extremists in the military. And he talked about the need to purge them. He talked about Nazis and Proud Boys, white supremacists, and so on. But he didn't talk about the real issue, which is far more significant than any of those groups, even though they're all somewhat associated with each other. And that's the strength of, they call themselves Christian nationalists. Some people call them Christian fascists. That the power of Christian nationalists in the armed forces, like I interviewed a guy named Mikey Weinstein who runs the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, and they fight the efforts of these right-wing evangelicals and right-wing Catholics as well, Opus Dei types and others, to force soldiers into religious recruitment, essentially. Weinstein thinks, and it's somewhat anecdotal, his estimate, but he's been at this for years and years. They have like 75,000 soldiers that have on their email list and that they work with. Anyway, he thinks it's not impossible, or I should put it the other way. He thinks it's likely 25 to 30% of the military is now Christian nationalist in an organized way. By organized, meaning at various officer levels, there are Christian nationalists essentially able to order pro-Christian nationalist troops around. And it goes to very high levels. I don't know how high, but he says very high. I mean, clearly, I don't know if any of them are in the Joint Chiefs. And I don't know what the story is on Flynn's brother is commander of the Pacific Forces, I believe. And apparently a real believer he's described as. So does that mean Christian nationalist? I don't know, but maybe. I mean, that's the real story of January 6th. Why did they take a threat of a coup so seriously? Because it didn't matter what Trump was doing, what his machinations were with Georgia and all the rest. The focus was on the intervention of the military. And if it wasn't the most senior military leadership, then who was it? And it's got to be these forces of Christian nationalism, Christian fascism in the military. And here's where the military has some problem. One, they're very strong. And you can't get rid of people just because of their religious beliefs. Three, this is a point Wilkerson made, is where are most of these Christian nationalists based? Well, in these rural, mostly poor states that are, guess what? The #1 states for recruiting soldiers. So what happens to your recruitment campaigns that they're already having trouble? I just saw an article. They're going to offer, $50,000 bonuses for people that volunteer to join the army. I mean, the armed forces. So you go and you piss off these areas where Christian nationalism are strong. Who the hell are you going to recruit? So they have real dilemma here because they've allowed this to fester. Why did they allow this kind of Christian nationalism to fester? Because one of the things about soldiers that are kind of true believers is they'll go out and die for you. And they won't ask too many questions. And if you want people to go out and kill the infidels in Iraq, because the Christian nationalists and the Islamic extremists are just two sides of the same coin, more or less. You need believers, especially, when soldiers who are not believers. You got to be a believer in Christian nationalism. At least you got to be a believer in Americanism. But that's a little bit harder to maintain these days. So they've got real trouble. So is there a real possibility that if they don't take back Congress in 2022, are they going to go nuts? Yeah. More likely, the way things are going, it looks like they are going to legitimately take back Congress to a large extent, because so much money has gone into capturing state legislatures. Then through these state legislatures, they're now rewriting the election laws, and they're going to, through voter suppression and other means, it's very difficult to see how the Democrats are going to keep control of perhaps both houses. And most importantly, the Democratic Party and its leadership have been abject failures at implementing the vision they campaigned on and supposedly had. Excuse me. And when I say failures, they had to have known Joe Manchin and this, woman from Arizona. They had to know that they were totally in the pockets of the most right-wing sections of the elites, the fossil fuel industry primarily. And they needed from day one to go into West Virginia and start promising and coming up with policy that is to do with real just transition, which is you promise fossil fuel workers you won't lose one penny of wages in the transition from fossil fuel to sustainable energy, and completely undercut Manchin's position in West Virginia. You would have forced him to go along with policies like that. But instead, they didn't. You know, the Biden administration didn't do that. And you know, there's other ways. What is it? Lyndon Johnson, you know, he was known to know how to knock heads. Well, you knock heads if you have to get Manchin and this other woman on board. But that's what the Democratic Party is, and that's kind of the problem here.
Yeah, well, and Manchin particularly has skeletons in his closet that you can use to knock heads with. I mean, his family has some issues. Biden knows that, and a lot of the neoliberals, the moderates, like that plan that it's a great idea to compensate these fossil fuel workers, to pay them to transition to green jobs. A lot of them will say, well, hell, we can't afford that. Do you have any idea what that will cost? Well, I don't know what it'll cost, but I know what the
actually,
F-30...
we do know.
Oh, you do?
No, we do know what it will cost. Bob Poland, the economist, modeled...
Dollar cost? Yeah.
Actually, yeah, to maintain the income level of every fossil fuel worker in the United States for 3 years, around $2 billion.
Oh, God.
Now, just to put that into perspective, one Ford-class aircraft carrier, is about $14 billion. So you can buy years of subsidization by building one less aircraft carrier. And frankly, you don't need any aircraft carriers because, one, there are already plenty, and two, they're useless because both the Russians and the Chinese can knock out one of those aircraft carriers in a matter of minutes. Like, it's the whole aircraft thing carrier is a boondoggle. But they didn't do it. So I want to talk just for a minute about the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
The reason the Democratic Party is what it is because it's an alliance of interests that paralyze it. It's first of all, it's predominantly dominated by finance capital, Wall Street, and you know, I actually once had lunch with one of the big labor leaders and his political advisor, and I said to him, why do you guys allow finance to simply get whatever they want? Democrats can't win without your knocking on doors, without the unions mobilizing votes. You know, they'd be nowhere. And he said, because if they don't finance these elections, the Republicans will win, and the labor law will be so terrible after that will be destroyed. So we have no choice but to allow finance to essentially dictate the policies of the Democratic Party. And that's it's a legitimate issue when you're sitting from the perspective that you have no faith in the working class and don't try to really mobilize them. But that is where most of the union leadership is. The other thing is that the Democratic Party is completely dependent on urban voters. They've practically ceded rural voters to the Republicans. They don't even try anymore.
Yeah, here in Iowa.
Another ridiculousness. But urban voters are smarter. Urban voters are far more multicultural, multi-ethnic, and so on. And you have to do something for them in terms of a little bit of economic policy that at least benefits working people a little bit. You got to do something in terms of not crushing unions, because you know it's in the urban centers where unions are strongest, not just public sector, but there and then some of the key industries. So the Democratic Party is an alliance that's really has very serious conflict of interest within its house. And an urban population they have to appeal to, you know, that can understand what, to a large extent, what's going on, certainly more. Now, the Republicans don't have that problem to a large extent. The Republicans, and there is a difference in how they see what the needs of the empire are, how they see, but most importantly, the difference between the preponderance of the Democrats and Republicans, I think, is how intensely can you exploit American workers? Mm-hmm. They differ on that. And part of the reason goes back to the Democrats need votes from the cities. So you got to allow a certain amount of unionization, a certain amount of alleviating of people's suffering, because one, they won't vote for you if you don't, and you might give rise to a more radical party or a radical force in the Democratic Party if you don't do something. Like take a look at mass incarceration. The top 10 states with the highest mass incarceration are all Republican states. And I think one of the first states, when you get to a Democrat state with relatively higher mass incarceration, and it's way less than the Republican states, it's Maryland. And that's because of Baltimore, mostly, and how many arrests take place there. But mass incarceration is way higher in Republican states. Now, it's not because they're nicer guys, or they're more the Democrats in Maryland or wherever, or, I don't know. They don't like to think of themselves as racist, but whatever. The Democrats have to appeal to get votes to a population where they have to do something for them. Whereas in the Republican states, the vast majority of people don't mind locking up a lot of black people. And the black population's smaller, and they don't have the same electoral clout. And now they've been able to gerrymander places, like in some of the states where there are, in states that are Republican, but you got a city like a Madison or something in Wisconsin, they've so gerrymandered these cities and carved them up that they take sections of the city and shove them in the same district with a majority white rural population. I think there was actually just a court decision just a few days ago actually said it wasn't legal in one of the states, but they've done so much of that.
Yeah.
So the Democratic Party, and I can believe Biden, wanted to pass the legislation that he wanted. And at the time when he first came to office, the recession was so deep and the pandemic had so paralyzed the economy. And all the subsidies and programs that they brought in quickly did not create any kind of inflation. The increased debt, nobody gave a damn. Wall Street completely reversed itself about worrying about debt. Nobody was talking about austerity. You listen to Bloomberg radio. They were all, pumped up the austerity, even more, even more. But the Republicans were saying something really important, even though they were claiming they were worried about inflation. It's bullshit. What they were really worried about, and occasionally said so, is that the working class would get used to not having to work for such shitty wages. They would lose labor discipline. I think that's what the economists like to call it. And what is labor discipline? It's desperation.
Yeah.
If the working class isn't desperate, you can't make them work for $7 or $8 an hour. If they're not desperate, then they might feel more confident about unionizing and going on strike. And to some extent, the Republicans were right. You're starting to see some of the effects of that. So, but early on, Biden had some wind in his sails to be the new FDR, and there's going to be the new Deal and all the rest. And lots of the financial sector supported it because much of his infrastructure plan, all these billions and billions of dollars of spending, who was going to get the money? Whoever owned the big contracting companies and consulting companies and all the rest. And they needed the economy to be juiced. But at the same time, they knew that they had two aces up their sleeve. I'm talking they being the financial sector. One, even though they didn't much like Trump, even when he first got elected, they made sure they poured money into the races in all the states. So the Republicans actually did better than previously in in terms of governorships and capturing state legislatures. So they had a real lever of power there. And then two, they knew they had the filibuster in the Senate.
Oh, yeah.
And the Senate itself is essentially undemocratic.
Right.
They knew they had the Supreme Court, which is chosen by an undemocratic institution. So they knew that even if Biden was going to do some, got too much FDR in him, they had many levers of power to stop him. And I think it was The Intercept released a phone call of Joe Manchin with some of his big donors where they made it very clear to him, do not let there be any change on the filibuster.
Yeah.
So they knew they could paralyze if there was any progressive instinct in Biden, and who knows, maybe he had some feeling that he could be the FDR, whatever. And maybe the progressives in the Democratic Party were being listened to a little more. And Bernie Sanders, to some extent had Biden's ear and all the rest. The elites always knew they could restrain anything from happening they didn't want to happen. And they have. Because Biden wanted to pay for this latest bill, through taxing the rich. And there's only one thing the rich hate more than higher income tax, and that would be a wealth tax. So I don't know where this is all heading. So where it's all heading now is that American capitalism, and thus global capitalism, is at a crossroads that in some ways is similar to the Great Depression of 1930s, but worse. The reason for worse is even in the depths of the Depression, the elites knew that the new sections of the elites wanted the New Deal and knew that kind of stimulation would help revive the economy. Other sections of the elites knew, well, we can always have a good war, and that will at least stimulate, because, what are good wars? They're just Keynesians with guns, right?
Yeah.
And so you can stimulate the hell. And then after the war, they figured out, you know what? Even if the war's over, all we need is a good existential enemy, and we'll spend even more and keep stimulating the economy through militarization. But here's why they're at a crossroads now that's more dangerous than that, and that's the climate crisis. You can't juice your way out of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
You need a fundamental restructuring of the economy. And you only get a fundamental restructuring of the economy and how energy is produced and used, especially with any kind of time frame that's going to work, if it's done through government, through public institutions. It ain't happening through the marketplace, and they all know it. The elites, the financial sector, they all know. But they won't let it happen. They do not want government to play that kind of role in the United States. Now, other capitalist countries, it's not quite the same. In some of the European countries, by far, I got to tell you, it's not like climate policy is great in Europe. Far from it. But at least there's a discussion about having a climate policy. Yeah. Here we're about to see a president and maybe a Congress that doesn't believe there is a climate crisis. So this is a real existential threat to the global capitalist system, especially American capitalism, that they won't have the restructuring it takes to deal with the climate crisis because they won't give up the kind of power they have by having a government that essentially does their bidding. Number two, They're facing a global threat. They see it as a threat, but it is to their global hegemony, and that's the rise of China. And they've never faced this before. The closest they came was Hitler. But you do the math, as World War II begins, you add up the GDP of England, United States, Canada, and the Soviet Union. Add up that GDP and compare it to Germany. There was no way Germany was ever going to win that war. Once these countries committed to fight and produce armaments and when the United States converts auto production to military production and so on, they're producing thousands of planes every week. I mean, there's a guy who wrote a great book about this. I wish I could remember the name of it. But I think it was by 1940 or 41 at least, if not earlier. Even the Germans knew they had to lose. It's just a question of how long it was going to take. And the Soviet Union had just too big an army and too willing to make sacrifice. And by that time, a capacity, it's unbelievable how they were able to move military production from the west to the east and so on and so on. So the crisis they're facing now there's only three ways out. One, denial about climate.
Yeah.
Hunker down. Assume that the rich will be able to mitigate the effects on their own families. Hope for some technological solution. And more or less status quo. So that's sort of the Democratic Party. A lot of talk about climate change, but they're so reliant on carbon capture and other kinds of technological schemes that even if it's ever possible, they're never going to happen soon enough. They're going to wind up putting all their eggs in nuclear energy basket. And I'm on the fence on that because as potentially dangerous as it is, as paralyzed as the politics is, it may be the only way to get to sustainable energy quickly enough.
But it's
maybe we'll have to live with some nuclear explosions and cities being damaged and whatever. I don't know. I mean, it's better than.
It's also too slow. They can't bring those nuclear power plants online quickly.
Well, that's what I think. But they claim the small ones can be. So I don't know. I don't see it, but that's a belief that a section of the billionaire class has.
Okay.
And they'll find a way to live in bubbles or something. The other is a kind of whatever is coming with climate and whatever's coming with China, there needs to be an end to this kind of liberal democracy in the United States. Because if you open the doors to any real conversation about climate change and how to deal with it, it's going to lead to a discussion of some form of socialism. Some way or another, it's going to have to do with public ownership, public regulatory policy. It's going to open the doors to the thing that they hate the most, and that's any possibility of moving towards a form of socialism in the United States. Yeah. So what's the alternative? A breaking down of the liberal democratic institutions. Even the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist, but he barely talked about public ownership. But even the Democratic Party did whatever they had to do to destroy their own democratic institutions to undermine Sanders. And that's part of something we know from WikiLeaks too, how the party, interfered and undermined Sanders and cheated on votes and everything else. These Democratic Party, the great defenders of our democratic institutions, couldn't keep their own bloody primaries democratic.
I know how.
So hated Sanders coming to power.
How well we know that here in Iowa. I mean, this was where the Shadow app struck first. And we're running out of time here. I'm going to bring this up on screen real quickly here because it's a nice segue, and we've talked about so many things. On the front page of the New York Times just today, and this one I want to get to, Paul, and maybe we'll just foreshadow a little bit and bring you back on to talk about it more in depth. But it's a situation in Ukraine. And you can, again, Paul's a great historian. You can straighten me out here because I've just got kind of a Midwestern rubes understanding or perspective on this. But you had the USSR broke down because of economics, and Ukraine went out on its own. But Ukraine, a lot of people don't understand, about a third of it, maybe a half of it, is pro-Russia. And they had a guy that was in charge of that country that was, a friend of Russia. In 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine. They overthrew that country. The United States was actively supporting that. I mean, they supported it, actively supported it. Now, we've got this situation where NATO and the United States is looking to have a big presence in Ukraine, which is right on the border of Russia. And if we remember what Paul was talking about earlier with these nuclear weapons and the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example, look what the United States did. It went to the brink of World War III over missiles pointed at us in Cuba. Well, this is right across the border from Russia. Now, I'm not a big Putin friendly. I mean, I don't want to be an apologist for this guy, but he's looking at this going, what in the hell? And the other segue is the energy thing that Paul was talking about, because there's this Nord Stream 2 pipeline up there that's going to run a gas pipeline into Eastern Europe. Russia wants that a lot. This United States-Ukraine involvement down there could prevent that from happening. So you've got this Russian population that would like to rejoin Russia. That's a big part of this. They're actually, I think, pleading with Putin to bring us back in. You've got this situation with NATO and the United States staring right across the border into Russia, and Putin doesn't want that with the weaponry pointed at him. And then you've got Nord Stream 2, the pipeline. All these things are in play, and it looks like Russia has some limited options here. I mean, it looks to me like they might strike, Paul. How imminent is it?
First of all, you made a very serious error in the very beginning of this show, and you called me an authority. You are really wrong. I'm not an authority on anything. I've just had a few years of talking to a lot of smart people, and I can remember some of it. So when it comes to the Ukraine, I'm really not an authority, but I can just put this into context somewhat, because there's a lot of people that can talk about the specifics of the situation better than I do. There's a lot of talk about the U.S. empire, and a lot of people want to make the U.S. empire out as if it's the devil. I'm not one of those people. And I think the term U.S. empire, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, sort of, but it gets overused and it covers up something. The real issue is the global capitalist system, of which the U.S., call it empire if you want, is the dominant, by far the dominant power, although we'll see, because they say in 15, 20 years, the Chinese GDP might surpass the American, and then we'll see. But it's still the dominant, by far dominant power, but it's a global capitalist system. Within a global capitalist system, different capitalist powers, countries, have their own agendas. There are some serious differences that can happen even between the United States and Canada over trade. Europe is constantly competing with the United States for influence in Eastern Europe, for example, for markets and other ways. There's tremendous competition takes place in terms of arms sales, with France and Germany competing with the United States and England competing. You just saw this submarine deal where the French lost this big contract to Australia. Yeah. A lot of global politics is driven by two things, the arms trade and oil. And there's some real conflicts. Now, yes, Europe on the whole, Western Europe, is under the general framework of American-led global capitalism, as is almost the entire world. I mean, what countries aren't? Except, to some extent, Russia the Soviet Union was out of it completely, more or less. And Russia, with the rise of a Russian state that could actually defend Russian sovereignty, as opposed to what was happening in the free-for-all of the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, where the United States thought they were going to be able to come in and grab all the natural resources of Russia, and to their horror, American and Western Europe's horror, the Russian, and many of them who had been in the party became oligarchs, and they grabbed all the oil and natural resources. And what a piss off that was to the West. What is it? You bloody Russians think you're going to
take the stuff,
steal all these resources that used to be public? No, we want to steal them. And we want to control the banking system. How dare you have your own banking system?
Right.
So this is a contradiction between oligarchies. An American oligarchy, various European oligarchies, the Russian oligarchy. This is a contradiction between capitalist states. Now, yes, most of Europe has found a way to work within the American system. The Russians have a problem working within the system, even though they wanted to. I mean, Russia wanted to join NATO, and they wouldn't let them. Why? NATO was supposed to be to quote Gore Vidal, fight the godless communists.
Yeah.
Well, what happened? You lost. They're not godless communists. Jesus, you can't get more religious than the Putin and his Orthodox Russian Church that he's closely aligned to. So all of a sudden, you have everything you wanted. Christ is back in Moscow. So why don't you let them into NATO? How about another question?
Yeah.
How about another question? Why have NATO? If the godless communists are gone, what is NATO for? Yeah. Well, obviously, it's because of arms sales.
Right.
It's excuses to pass money. Like, what is it? The Biden administration just announced $200 million subsidy to Ukraine to buy arms. Oh, you're so generous. Who are you buying the arms from, Ukraine? It's a pass-through.
It's a money laundering scheme.
Give the money to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians can give the money to American arms manufacturers.
Yeah, same way with the Saudis, yeah.
Well, same with the Russians. The Russians have their own military-industrial complex. And the tenser things get on the border with Ukraine, the easier it is for Putin to justify increasing military expenditures and pleasing his own oligarchs and military-industrial complex. And for that matter, the Chinese have one too, but it's not as pernicious as the Americans and Russians. Now, let me say, whenever I say something like this, the Americans are in a league of their own. Nothing compares with the scale of the war crimes, militarization,
yes,
foreign military bases, on and on. Like nothing the Russians, Chinese, or anybody else does.
Combined,
Combined. But that doesn't mean the Russians don't have their own oligarchical-driven agenda. But that agenda is not to invade and try to occupy anybody right now, because it's a pain in the ass. Like, if it was profitable to invade, occupy, and dominate countries, wouldn't the Americans be doing it everywhere?
Yeah, didn't work for us, yeah.
It doesn't work. It hasn't worked since, like, the mid-1800s.
Yeah.
Old-style colonization isn't profitable because people fight back.
Yes.
It's too hard to control.
Yes.
Now, are the Russians meddling in Ukrainian politics? Are they going to try to, in one way or another, have a government in Ukraine that's more allied with them?
Sure.
Duh. Yeah, of course. And the Americans haven't done exactly the same thing. In fact, essentially having already organized a coup against the previous president who was aligned with Russia.
Yeah.
And the Americans do it everywhere. God, the Americans completely interfered in the Canadian election in 1962 and dumped Prime Minister Diefenbaker because he wouldn't accept nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. Not because he had
that.
anything against nuclear weapons, but he wanted the Canadian government to control them. And so Kennedy organized to literally sent Lou Harris, the pollster, with a false name and a false passport to the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. And he organized the campaign of Lester Pearson, who became prime minister, and let the nuclear weapons into Canada. Yeah, of course, the Russian oligarchy tries to defend and expand and enrich itself, just like the American oligarchy. They just don't have the power the Americans do. So do I think this is mostly saber rattling on the part of Putin. I think it's in as much tension as he can create. It triggers all this kind of Cold War shit in the American psyche, and especially in the military-industrial complex, and all the hawks love this.
Good for business. Yeah.
Now, is he really thinking to invade? This is my opinion, and what the hell do I know, because I'm no expert in this area or any other. But I doubt it. I think it's create as much tension as you can. Make it really clear that Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO. And I would guess the Americans are going to, and probably already have, told him quietly that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. There's no, I think that they have to have consensus of NATO to have a new member. There's no way all of Europe will agree to have Ukraine in NATO. Mm-hmm. The bigger issue in terms of threat is these nuclear weapons systems that are in some of the countries that used to be in the Warsaw Pact and now are in NATO that can hit Moscow in 4 or 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. That is a threat. But really, how big a threat? Do they really think, does Moscow really think they're going to fire nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union? Because there's something the Soviet Union has that so do the Americans have. And it doesn't matter if they can hit Moscow or whatever in 4 or 5 minutes. It's something called submarines. You cannot hit the Russian submarines any more than the Russians can hit American submarines. And the Russian submarines can throw plenty of nuclear weapons into the United States anytime. So just because you have some weapons near the border, it sounds threatening. But in reality, it really isn't threatening, any more threatening than American submarines that can already do exactly that.
Yeah.
In fact, the American submarines are far more threatening than any missiles sitting in Eastern Europe because the Russians know where those are and they can target them. They can't target the submarines. The real deterrence in this world is the submarines, which is why Ellsberg, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, the number one thing that needs to be done immediately is eliminate ICBMs. Because they have no military value. They're just sitting duck targets, or they're going to be used in a first strike, but they can't be used as a first strike against the subs. Mm. So you can't even really have the first strike and not get hit yourself. So it's all a kabuki theater. It's all bullshit. It's all for money making.
Yes.
But, and here's the big but, this can get out of control.
And it can happen by accident. That's the other part of it.
That's my point. It can happen by accident. It can happen because they're playing this who can pissing game.
Yeah.
And it can spiral either out of control or by accident or a combination thereof. So it's extremely dangerous. And the danger isn't Russia invading Ukraine. The danger is this level of tension could trigger a nuclear war, even if all the best reasonable people on both sides don't want it. And we almost had that during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
So they should stop the bullshit. And the Democratic Party, any progressives in the Democratic Party should speak up and denounce this Russophobia this hearkening the demons of the Cold War, which is
Yeah.
what they did with this Russian interference in the elections.
Yes.
Like I kept saying at the time,
Yeah.
I don't give a shit if the Russians interfered in the elections.
Yeah. We do
If
it all the
everything
time.
they
Yeah.
said about what they did was true,
It's not worth
it
destroying the
doesn't
world
come
over.
close to undermining American democracy, to what the American oligarchy's done to American democracy. Not even close. And it didn't
Yeah.
affect the real outcome of the election.
Yeah. And all the PACs and all the money that we have.
do I know if they're going to invade or not? I doubt it.
No.
I think it's
Good.
all for show. I could be wrong,
I hope you're right.
but it doesn't mean it isn't very dangerous.
Yeah, because, I used to say on the show, particularly in 2020, that we live in a 2020 world where we could all be dead in 20 minutes from an accidental strike from a nuclear submarine, or we could all be dead in 20 years from climate change. That's the 2020 world that we live in. And like I said, Putin's sitting there looking at the Ukraine thinking, shit, it could be 4 or 5 minutes where he's at. I mean, this is the tension that's good for that complex that Paul talked about, that's good for business, but it could end it all for everyone. And that kind of brings us full circle here with the Doomsday Machine and the movie that he's working on with Daniel Ellsberg. Again, I want to promote that. I'm going to be looking for that movie. That's going to be a great documentary. And again, want to mention that Paul J., our guest today, thanks for coming on board the live line. He's a journalist and filmmaker. He's the founder and host of the Analysis.News. I'm going to super that during the show here. It'll be a Chiron, a lower third that runs so that people can go there as well. And Paul, I'm just going to give it maybe to you for other websites or URLs you would like to see on the show.
I say one thing before we finish.
Yeah.
Because it's been pretty doom and gloom for the
Yeah.
last hour and 20 minutes.
Yeah, it has, yeah.
There's some very important organizing going on now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of big strikes across the country. A lot of unions have become far more active in organizing unorganized workers. There's some really interesting organizing going on in places like West Virginia, where they're really working to elect progressive at all kinds of levels of government and eventually to challenge Manchin or people like Manchin. That's where we need to turn our attention.
Yes.
You talk about geopolitics, as we have been, and even the domestic politics and the rise of Christian fascism and all this. Most of the people involved, who are the sort of ordinary people that get embroiled in these things, what do they want? They want their family to be healthy. They want their kids to be safe. They want to have a job. They don't want to worry about losing their house and going bankrupt. And amongst many of the Christians, they want and believe in the Jesus of forgiveness and love, not the Christianity of the Crusades, which is what Christian nationalism is. People can talk to people. Organizing can take place. I don't think this situation is hopeless. I don't think we should write off the 75 million people that voted for Trump, and right now it's looking like even more might. Far from it. The organizing won't be done by the corporate Democrats. Progressives working in the party, I think, are making a contribution. I don't see how there's any other party that can be established in the time frame we have, except maybe in local races, and that might work, even maybe in some states. I don't know. But the threat of the far right, we have to balance this threat of the far right, the rise of this Christian fascism, and the real character of corporate Democrats. But at least in some areas, it gives room to organize. Like right now in West Virginia, there's organizing going on, really good organizing. If Christian nationalists all out, full out ran West Virginia, I think those people would be in jail.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you'd have any real organizing going on in West Virginia right now. And it's because this real fascistic force has not consolidated its control in that area. But we could be looking at areas like it was before the civil rights movement, or even during, where cops would go out and assassinate organizers and activists. Trump practically called for that during the Black Lives Matter protests. Throw these people in jail for decades, I think was his quote.
Dog whistler.
Well,
yeah.
that is what they will do. And progressives who think there's no difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, I think, are being delusional. The level of repression will be far greater. Why? I'll go back to an earlier point and then I'll be done. Not because the corporate Democrats are nicer guys. They like to think of themselves as nicer guys. And that does play somewhat of a role. No, it's because their constituency in the big cities won't go along with that kind of shit. So they can't play the same role the Republicans play. And as I say, they don't really, in terms of how they see themselves, they're great believers they can have capitalism without its excesses. They really believe it. And of course it's nonsense, but they think so. So it's a very complicated situation, but it's not hopeless by any means. All of us need to figure out how to, if you can't actually get trained to organize yourself, support people that are. I said in my New Year's message, we're at the analysis really going to try to focus more on letting people know who are the organizers, what are the obstacles they're facing, and try to articulate better some of the issues that are confusing people that are getting duped by this rising fascism, or duped by corporate Democrats. Because, I said before the last election, people should vote for Biden, but without illusions. And those illusions are very dangerous. So, we got to speak the whole truth, not just some partisan truth.
That's great. That's a great place to leave it. And folks, go to theanalysis.news, subscribe, get the newsletter, contribute, support Paul's work so that we continue to get this kind of truth-telling. Paul J., thanks again for coming on this edition, long version here of Podcast by George.
Thanks very much, George.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George and guests like Paul J., go to podcastbygeorge.com. Just pick an icon, a platform there where you'd like to subscribe. Click on the little badge. It'll take you straight to that location. Facebook's a good example. YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, even places like that. And you'll get each and every episode and be notified when new shows are released. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.